What is killing healthy young Americans? Is it the COVID shots? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. For the last couple years, we have, in America anyhow, seen videos, heard stories, read stories online about people getting these COVID shots, and then suddenly their hearts stop pumping. Suddenly they're fainting on football fields and being carted away on gurneys to medical facilities and fates unknown. Suddenly people are dying. Can we trust the data that the government puts forth on this? Can we trust it when the government and their partners in media come forward and say, hey, nothing to see here, no worry, go home. Oh, and on the way home, stop and get that 4th, 5th, or 6th booster shot. Can we trust Joe Biden when he says, what? There's nothing to worry about. Look, I got the shots. I got the vaccines. I get vaccines every day. Every day I get a new COVID booster. And look at me. Nothing happens to me. Okay, so maybe Joe Biden and his health are not the best examples here. But look, fact or fiction, the reality is people in America are wondering about the safety of the COVID shots, which I don't call vaccines, shots. People are wondering about the safety and wondering if the stories they hear of people suffering adverse health impacts, such as myocarditis or other health issues, other heart issues, or strokes, if people suffering these things really are indicative of shots that aren't safe, shots that aren't as safe as the government promised they would be, and shots that should be avoided at all costs. That's the big question in the air, the big elephant in the room. And before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for your faith-based podcasts, at washingtontimes.com, or wherever podcasts are offered. Listen to this headline from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention own website, updated February 27th, 2023. Selected adverse events reported after COVID-19 vaccination. And the CDC goes on to say that CDC's Vaccine Safety Data Link, or VSD, met the statistical criteria to prompt additional investigation into whether there was a safety concern for ischemic stroke in people ages 65 and older who received the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine bivalent. To date, no other safety systems have shown a similar signal, and multiple subsequent analyses have not validated this signal. And then in bold, CDC writes this: no change is recommended in COVID-19 vaccination practice. And then below, in a separate block, CDC writes this: safety of COVID-19 vaccines. Some people have no side effects. Many people have reported side effects, such as headache, fatigue, and soreness at the injection site that are generally mild to moderate and go away within a few days. But the CDC, in the next line, writes, COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective, and severe reactions after vaccination are rare. And now the CDC, as you know, recommends everyone ages 6 months and older get vaccinated as soon as possible to protect against COVID-19 and its potentially severe complications. The federal government, as you are aware, I'm sure, just a couple weeks ago, opened the door for school systems around the nation and community local governments around the nation to mandate these COVID-19 shots as conditions for children entering school in kindergarten, entering school for the first time. They opened the door for these shots to be mandated as part of babies' regular vaccination schedule, part of the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox shots. Add to that now the COVID-19 shots. That's the recommendation. That's not to say that school systems and your local pediatrician are going to be working hand in hand to mandate that your child must have these shots as conditions of going to daycares or as conditions of going into public schools. But it gives these locals the right to bring about laws, bring about policies, bring about guidance to, in effect, mandate parents have to put their children into this lifelong shot trend, right? Because every time they come out with a new COVID booster, you're supposed to get that booster in order to prevent, I don't know how they even use that word, prevent the spread of the variant that COVID has morphed into. Or what they've done now is tone down that language. No longer do vaccines or vaccinations prevent the vaccinated from getting the illness or transmitting the illness to others, but rather getting the vaccine lessens your chance of getting the illness and lessens your chance of dying from the illness or overburdening the hospitals with patients who have the illness. So it's all sort of wishy-washy, up in the air, the efficacy of these shots, which if you go back in time and remember, all the shots that came out under emergency use authorization, all the shots from all the companies carried with them promises of upwards of 90% efficacy, some of them even 97% efficacy. They were effective, very effective shots, we were told. And not only that, they also carried 100% safety. These shots are safe. They're safe and effective. How many times do we hear Dr. Anthony Fauci tell us that? Or Joe Biden? These shots are safe and effective. And if you don't get these shots, you are contributing to the spread of the coronavirus. And you're killing, or putting in danger of being killed your neighbors, your friends, your elderly, your family even. And then come to find out, wait a minute, just wait a few months and whoa, that 97% efficacy rate has dropped to 60%. Or wait a minute, wait another month and now here we are down at 40%. 40% and dropping fast. And the safety? Still, the federal tagline on safety of these shots is nothing to see here. Yes, there are a few cases of heart issues or ischemic stroke issues, but by and large, nothing to see here. No reason to not get the shot. No reason to not get the booster. No reason to not get all the boosters that come about from Big Pharma. These mandates that the federal government under Joe Biden put us through regarding the COVID shots have to be one of the most evil things to seep onto America soil in years. Mandating American citizens have to take shots that are largely experimental because no long-term studies have been conducted because they haven't been around long enough for the long-term studies to have been conducted. So they're largely experimental, using American citizens as lab rats and guinea pigs for Big Pharma to run and race with its multi-billion dollar money-making venture called speedy approval process of experimental shots is definitely one of the most wicked political moves in American history in a very long time. It played on Americans' fears, and it used those fears to justify not just seizures of individual liberties, but a complete collapsing of a medical system that was rooted in the idea of patient consent. And without accountability for these mandates, without holding Big Pharma and their political partners accountable for the adverse health impacts that have come from these mandated shots, from the job losses that have been suffered due to the refusal of some in America to participate in the vaccine mandates, to the military, who is forced to become the guinea pigs for this experimental vaccine program. Without accountability for that, we are doomed to repeat this history. And under Joe Biden, we are doomed in the next couple years of his administration to, yes, indeed, continue to repeat and continue to repeat again. And yes, I understand how that is grammatically improper, but I don't know how to describe the ability of this president to push nonsensical, damaging, dangerous policies over and over and over, despite the data that show the danger of the policies that he's pushing over and over and over. Just in February, at his State of the Union, Joe Biden said this.
More than 1 million Americans lost their lives to COVID. 1 million. Families grieving, children orphaned. Empty chairs at the dining room table constantly reminding you that she used to sit there. Remembering them, we remain vigilant. We still need to monitor dozens of variants and support new vaccines and treatments. So Congress needs to fund these efforts and keep America safe.
And there you have it, the big reason for this constant push for booster after booster after booster. Congress needs to fund these efforts. It's a big money-making venture. Big Pharma has stumbled on the genius evil of rushing shots through the permitting process, through the approval process, instead of taking between 5 and 10 years to get a shot, a vaccine, a real vaccine, from creation to patient arm. Big Pharma has managed under COVID to speed up the process from creation to patient arm to about 6 months, to less than a year. And that's a big money-making venture for them. So as Big Pharma has become addicted to the idea of billion-dollar easy funding from sped-up shots approved for patient use, so too politicians who are in bed with Big Pharma. So too are they enamored with the idea of investing in these companies that they then support with legislation or with congressional mandates or with congressionally turned blind eyes toward the executive office's mandates to get more and more and more of these drugs into the arms of American citizens. And the big secret here is that taxpayers, by and large, fund this whole system. Big Pharma gets to tap into tax dollars in order to push shots into the arms of American citizens, which are mandated in many cases by the federal authorities, who in turn profit with Big Pharma from these mandated shots. What a system. What a great system for those who are part of the game, right? And too bad for those who suffer adverse health impacts, adverse health effects from these shots. You know, you listen to Joe Biden's State of the Union clip there, and first you hear the data, the scary data, more than 1 million Americans have died from COVID. Well, question mark that, because we don't exactly know. States reporting COVID deaths, first off, use different criteria when they reported those so-called COVID deaths. For instance, some states reported COVID deaths when the death of the patient in their care died specifically from the coronavirus. Many other states reported as COVID deaths those patients who died with COVID, but along with other health issues. So we don't know fully, we don't know truthfully if the deaths in America, all the deaths in America and around the world for that matter, were due solely to COVID or were due to other factors along with COVID. So the 1 million Americans who have died from COVID, question mark that. Second, Joe Biden starts off with the emotional manipulation. People who have died and now their seats at the dinner table in your homes are empty, and you stare longingly at those empty seats, remembering before COVID, remembering the times when your loved one was there. And then he kicks in with the meat of his message, which is to say, get your COVID shots, get your boosters, and this empty seat sad syndrome won't happen to you. Mandates are the problem here. If mandates weren't in effect, a lot of Americans who suffered adverse health impacts would not have suffered these adverse health impacts because they would have had choice. They would have had free choice. They would have had something that really has been part of the healthcare system in America for a very long time. Informed consent. But suddenly, for the good of your neighbor, for the good of those who wanted to live more in fear than in faith, for the good of the community and the country and so forth, you, Citizen A, had to take shot after shot after shot in order to go walk about on the public street and do your daily business and go to church and go to school and so forth. Thankfully, these mandates have been pushed by and large to the side, but without lessons learned, history can repeat. And the fact is, without accountability for the damage these mandates and these vaccines have caused, many in America, many around the world, history, again, can definitely repeat. And thankfully, I have a very interesting guest today who looks at the COVID shot data and moves past the policies and politics to talk about an issue that really, when it comes to mandates with these shots, is the scariest of all. Do people just die from these shots suddenly? And why is the government so reluctant to explore that question? Edward Dowd is not afraid to ask that question. What is killing healthy young Americans? His new book, Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022, is a blockbuster. And he is here right now, I'm happy to say, to discuss some of his findings. Ed, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate what you're doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the findings of your latest book, Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022. What did you find?
Well, unfortunately, I found some news that isn't going to please people, but it's the truth. Since 2021, we've had a flip in health outcomes for the employed of our country, meaning excess death and disabilities seem to have crawled into the employed population of the U.S. and globally as well. We found this in other countries. So much so that I'm blaming the vaccines, obviously, max vaccination program and mandates. Typically speaking, the employed of the nation are much healthier than the general U.S. population. And so much so that the group life policyholders of America, these are the folks that work for the Fortune 500 and mid-sized companies. A group life policy is something you get as a throwaway benefit when you sign on to one of these outfits. It's 1 to 2 times your base salary should you die. It's a great business for insurance companies, but it's great because these people aren't expected to die ages 25 to 64. And they did a study in 2016, the Society of Actuaries, to prove what they already knew, which is that this group of individuals dies at a third the rate of the general U.S. population in any given year. Well, in 2021, something went off the rails, and that group experienced 40% excess mortality. That report came out in August of 2022. It can be found on the Society of Actuaries website. And they also noticed that the general U.S. population experienced 32% mortality, and they were shocked and surprised because that's a relationship that I told you about previously, inverted. So they don't make a claim. I'm the one that's the analyst. I make the claim that it's the vaccine causing this. And if you look at the data that they presented in Table 5.7 of that report, they showed something rather alarming. In the third quarter of 2021, millennials, the 25 to 44 age category, experienced 84% excess mortality, and they were running at around 30 in the spring before the mandates came. And the mandates, I believe, caused a lot of vaccine-hesitant millennials to come off the sidelines because, as we knew, COVID did not kill young people. So this is the tragedy that happened, I believe, due to the vaccines, and the disability data is just as stark. The employed of our country have experienced worse health outcomes versus the general U.S. population, but the whole population has been affected. In 2021, February 2021, disabilities, as reported by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, took off. The prior 4 years, it was running around 29 to 30 million, bouncing around for the prior 4 years. Then it took off and went to 33.2 million into the September of 22 time frame. That's an additional 3.2 million Americans added to the disability rolls, or about 10%. And when we looked into the numbers, 1.7 million of those were employed. And then when we looked at the disability rates, we found that the employed had an increase in that time frame between February of 21 and November of 22 of 31% versus the general U.S. population of 8%. And it's even worse when you look at those not in labor force. Those are folks who are identified as willing to work and able to work, meaning they probably quit or get fired because of vaccine mandates. Their health outcome was the best. They only experienced a 4% increase in their disability rate. So it's tragic what's gone on in my mind, and it's a national security issue. And I said that to Senator Ron Johnson in December when he had the COVID committee talking series.
So now you're a wealth of data, and I take it that you come at this research from a numbers point of view, not really driven by the policy and politics. But the fact checkers I see have come out in full force to debunk your findings. And one of the things that they suggest is that the deaths aren't due to the vaccines, which I'm not sure how you feel about actually calling those vaccines. I call them shots, but you can give your viewpoint on that as well. They say that it's not due to the shots, but rather to COVID type causes. And how do you respond to that?
Well, let's think about that for a second. In 2020, it was primarily old people who died. Then there's what we call a mix shift on Wall Street to mostly young in 2021 and 22. And what happened in the third quarter of 2021 was an event. And I've heard three. I'll give you three excuses they give. Not only COVID, but they also say suicides, drug overdoses, and missed cancer screening treatments. Let me look at each one of these.
Right.
First, there wasn't a suicide pact amongst the elite of our workers in the Fortune 500 in the third quarter. Millennials didn't decide to off themselves in a suicide pact. So that you throw that out the window. Drug overdoses for this elite group does not occur because to get this policy, you have to be employed at the time. And I don't know many fentanyl and heroin users who keep their jobs for too long. And just the fact that everyone decided to overdose on heroin makes no sense. The final one, cancer screening, that age group does not get cancer screenings, number one. Number two, I've never had one in my life. I'm 56. There's only 5 cancers that traditionally get screened for. And right now we have a whole rash of cancers that are exploding. So that couldn't be identified by any test anyway. So it makes no sense. And for all three to happen at the same time makes no sense. It's statistically impossible. Let's address COVID, or what they're calling long COVID. You got to remember the most virulent variant was in 2020. It morphed into Delta, and then and the excess mortality for millennials in 2020 was not as high as it was in the third quarter of 2021. So it's hard for people to say Delta, which was less deadly than the original variant, decided to target millennials that were employed at Fortune 500 companies ages 25 to 44. And also this phenomenon of long COVID, there's been no study linking long COVID to excess death, number one. Number two, long COVID doesn't even have a clinical definition yet, and I suspect they won't come up with one, primarily because a lot of the symptoms and adverse reactions around long COVID mysteriously mimic the vaccine injuries that are in theirs. So long COVID doesn't seem like a real excuse to me. And then as we continue into 2022, we have Omicron and 23 currently. The millennials, as reported by the Society of Actuaries, are still experiencing 23% excess mortality in the second quarter. Those are the official numbers. The third quarter numbers, I've been told by my whistleblower, are going to come in at 23% again. So it's not improving. And then the fourth quarter, I'm hearing, is looking like it might reaccelerate. So when that data comes out, I'll make it available. But the early readings are excess mortality is continuing amongst the employed with Omicron, which is nothing more than a head cold at this point. So the fact checkers are not only wrong, they're being deceitful.
In March, there are a group of attorneys who are gathering in Atlanta for a 2-day conference on litigation, pushing back on some of these COVID mandates, the shots, the people who were forced out of work, people who were forced out of the military, and so forth. Whatever comes out of that, it seems like it's going to be very interesting and potentially a game changer for those in America who did not play along with the fears of the coronavirus clampdowns on liberty. Do you see that as sort of the end game of all this coronavirus madness, the attorneys getting involved?
Oh, the attorneys are going to get involved, and the numbers are so stark that once we get what I call the marginal mind, the court of public opinion, to switch and shift, and it will, the immunity that the pharmaceutical companies currently enjoy will disappear and vaporize, because once people realize what's happened, there won't be a judge in the land that will let the immunity stand. And I expect new case. I'm not a lawyer, but I expect new case law where a judge might come out and say, you violated the spirit of immunity, and you didn't inform the public to the dangers. Because what we're finding is that the clinical trials, the adverse reactions we're seeing in the real world, they knew it then. And we just put out a study recently that suggests that it was the same order of magnitude as we're seeing in the real world. So they knew then in the clinical trials that it was unsafe, but they went ahead anyways. And they should have shut down the trial immediately for safety reasons, but they did not.
I want to go back to something you said just a minute ago, that you truly believe the court of public opinion will flip. I want to believe that, but I live in Northern Virginia, and every time I go down the road, I see people driving alone in their cars with face masks. And every time I go into a hospital or medical facility, face masks are required, mandatory, and so forth. I'm not as optimistic that people are ready to put aside their fear and resume some sort of normal living.
Well, so I unfortunately have been of the opinion that people are slow to wake up to this, and I agree with you. But the problem is the trends I'm seeing are not abating. So at some point, the deaths and disabilities are going to become so large that people are going to start to notice.
Wow.
Even if the mainstream media doesn't tell them, they'll notice themselves. So that's why I'm so focused on trying to stop the vaccination program to mitigate the damage. But unfortunately, unless the media comes clean or we have some adults in Washington that stand up, this will continue until it's too late. That's my fear.
That is something I agree wholeheartedly with. It's so sad and pitiful that it has to get to the worst case scenario of people dying from these shots and from the government's forcing people to get these shots before politicians take action and reverse course. Yeah,
the warning signals for this flared off in theirs in January and February of 2021. But they continued full steam ahead. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 56. And I was young, but I remember the swine flu vaccine, and I did some research on that. And that had 25 deaths, and they shut down the program. We're well over 18,000 reported vaccine deaths in theirs, and we're just rolling right along.
Is this simply for money, or do you see some sort of globalist, the Great Reset agenda at play here? What do you see as the reasons that the stubborn insistence to take these shots?
Well, so in my book, I left out the who and the why. I only focus on that it is, and it's the vaccines. But I have an opinion, and I'll give you my opinion freely. I believe the coordination that we saw from the global governments with all the same verbiage and same talking points. When is the last time you ever saw global governments agree on one thing? Never. So that piqued my interest. And I think what we have going on is a global sovereign debt crisis. We're at the end of a 100-plus year Federal Reserve system. And COVID was a system of control designed to stop protests, keep people in fear. And I think a lot of people took advantage of it, especially central banks and politicians. So I believe COVID was a control system.
Yep, that's how I see it as well. I know our time's coming to a close, but I just wonder if maybe you can speak to some of the more egregious examples of sudden deaths that you found during your research. Perhaps we've already seen some of them in the news.
I'm loath to talk about specific cases. I just present them in the book, and I like to talk about the metadata. What I can say is that the same study in 2006 I talk about in my book suggested that they did a 38-year study on sudden athletic death, and they found as many as they could that were documented, and they found 1,101 over 38 years. That's 29 a year on average. We'd be lucky since 2021 to have a month with just 29 sudden athletic deaths. We have months with sometimes 90, 100, 110, and these are global. So that number alone, and in my book I have hundreds of examples, hundreds and hundreds of examples. Just based on the average in my numbers, it's a 12-fold increase, and I'm not even getting all the ones that should be put in the book. We just didn't have enough space to put all the dead people.
Wow.
Unfortunately.
Wow, unbelievable. And the fact checkers keep doing their false fact checking of your true facts. Cause unknown, the epidemic of sudden deaths in 2021 and 2022. Thank you so much for doing this research. It's very meticulous, but it's much needed. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
You too. Look, no matter how you feel about the COVID shots, no matter how you feel about the COVID shot mandates, no matter how you feel about the booster after booster and the federal government's continued insistence that Americans as young as age 6 months receive these shots, you have to ask yourself, what about the adverse health impacts? What about the question mark about these sudden deaths of young Americans? Are they in any way related to the COVID shots? And so what if you don't like that question? So what if it makes you uncomfortable? As an American citizen, you have a duty to explore the truth on that. And look, as an American citizen, you have a duty to insist that your government allow open, transparent exploration of this very question to go forth. Starting with, pick up a copy of this book and check out the data and see if it raises any question marks in your head about the safety and efficacy of these COVID-19 shots and boosters that the government still insists under its experimental and emergency use authorization, as it still is, still insist are 100% safe and pretty much effective. Check it out. If you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, and of course, wherever fine podcasts are offered. I appreciate you Bold and Blunt listeners out there who subscribe to Bold and Blunt. It really means a lot to me. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.